Week 7. And if you are mathematically minded, you will realize that out of a 13-week study, 7 is over the halfway point. And we've reached what is technically the halfway point in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14. Again, mathematically, there are 28 chapters. 14 then is the halfway point. And things will begin to escalate. If you've read through Matthew before, you know that the latter half of it is a roller coaster ride into conspiracy, betrayal, and then leading up to arrest, crucifixion, and then the resurrection. But right now, at chapter 14, we have a little bit of a flashback. And it begins with Herod the Tetrarch. All right. We're going to have to talk about Herod and the Herod family in a moment. But first, I want to draw your attention to the first 2 verses. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers are at work in him." So he has very odd ideas about the resurrection, but he's gaining interest in Jesus. Now, nothing good ever happens to people who draw the interest of the dynasty that came from Herod the Great. Remember, Herod the Great himself was the one who was asked, "Where is the King of the Jews who's just been born?" And of course, he, being King of the Jews, is like, oh, And if you know anything about the family history, you know that Herod the Great, basically the patriarch of the family, loved to name his sons after himself, which gets very confusing, and had no qualms about killing family members. He had 10 known wives, not all together, like in a polygamous marriage, but sequential. He killed several of those, divorced others. He had multiple children, and was known to have executed at least 3 of his sons and their mothers and various other people attached to them because he thought they were a threat to him. Now, of course, when somebody says the King of the Jews has been born, he hasn't had any new children lately, and to be honest, even if he had, if he thought they were going to supplant him, he would have killed them himself. So that's Herod the Great. What we're talking about here is Herod, sometimes known as the Tetrarch, also known as Herod Antipas. Now, Herod Antipas was renowned for, and this good old-fashioned word, profligacy. He could not keep money in his pocket. He lived high and usually on somebody else's expense because he never had any. He couldn't keep any money of his own. He spent it as soon as he had it. But this is him later in life, where he's settled down, sort of, to ruling this area. And Tetrarch just means he's been given charge of 4 different areas. He could be called a king loosely, but he is a Roman representative. And of course, the whole family is mixed Jewish and Edomite blood, but none of the Herods or Herod relatives were ever any more Jewish than it took to avoid provoking the populace. Let's put it that way. So you have this statement of his This very muddle-headed, well, this must be John the Baptist, whom I just recently killed, raised from the dead. That's why he can do miracles. Won't try to trace out the theology of that one. But then we have the flashback. Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison. Why? For the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Now here's where things get really confusing. When they say brother Philip's wife, they're talking about Herod Philip, also known as Herod II. I believe he was either the second or the third born son of Herod the Great. But Herodias was the daughter of another son of Herod the Great. So she was Herod's granddaughter. And Herod had killed her father and her mother and several other people for being an alleged threat to him. And since that left her out on a limb, Herod the Great had then married her off to his son, Herod II, also sometimes known as Herod Philip. Not to be mistaken with just plain Philip, another of his sons by a different wife. I'll mention why I mentioned him later. But then Herod II, Herod Philip, he also got on his father's bad side, but he was just far enough outside the situation that he didn't get killed. Instead, he got disowned and ended up living in Rome as a private citizen. And Herodias didn't like that. Herodias was a very ambitious woman. So she divorced him, married his half-brother, Herod Antipas. That's where we get to where we are right now. So she divorced one uncle and married another. That's the Herod family for you. And so John, being a prophet of God, denounces this, among other things. And Herodias, she doesn't like that. This popular prophet has just told the people that her new marriage is unlawful. And she, being ambitious, thinks it's perfectly lawful for her to do this. This is what she wants to do. But Herod Antipas, you kind of get the feeling that he was not only kind of a riotous liver, but he's also very wishy-washy. He says he wanted to put him to death, but he feared the people. And if you look at other gospels, you'll find that he actually sent for John and listened to him preach and enjoyed it greatly. But, then there are other considerations. For example, Herod's birthday comes around. Herodias' daughter, I'll explain something about her in a moment, she dances before the company and pleased Herod. Now, in that phraseology, it sounds fairly neutral. But given the way that Herod threw parties, and we know something about this from outside historical sources, there was a very good chance that this was the sort of dance that you don't really bring. It's not family viewing. And so he enjoyed it greatly, which is kind of creepy because it's his stepdaughter, and she's probably only somewhere between 12 and 14 years old at this time. And so he promises in front of his guests with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. And of course, her mother, being the voice in her ear, says, "Tell him, give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And here's where we get a lot of that flavor of wishy-washiness. The king was sorry. It's like you stepped on somebody's foot. Oh, I'm so sorry. He just beheads a guy, but he's sorry he had to do it. But his oaths and his guests, they're way more important to him than the life of one of God's prophets. So he has it done. John's beheaded in prison, head's brought on a platter, given to the girl. She gives it to her mother. The only redeeming part of this story is that his disciples are allowed to take his body away and give it decent burial. And then they go and tell Jesus all about all this. And to be honest, until I was going through this story, I hadn't really thought about it. Apart from the fact that, they went to tell Jesus that John was dead, knowing that he was a relative. But also, there is some thought that they might be going to tell him that Herod is starting to pay attention to him, which is a double reason why Jesus would withdraw to a desolate place. Oh, and by the way, postscript of that story, that charming family scene, Herodias's daughter, identified by outside sources as a girl named Salome, ends up marrying just plain Philip, that other son of Herod, and becoming her own mother's sister-in-law and aunt. Take a while to think about that. Anyway, enough about the Herodians and their nonsense. Jesus withdraws, but it's so hard for him to withdraw. He goes to the most desolate place he can find and is overwhelmed by crowds. But the thing is, unlike most of us, when we go out and we want to be alone and people won't leave us alone, he has compassion on them. He heals those who are imposing on him. Right? He healed their sick. And in the evening, disciples like, desolate place, send them away. They have to go buy food for themselves. That sounds practical. Jesus, though, says they need not go away. You give them something to eat. And the Greek is really that emphatic. You do it. You give them something to eat. And their response is, how? They took a pool and they found they only had 5 loaves of bread and a couple of pickled fish. It's like saying, we've got a couple of tortillas and a tin of herring. I was like, what is this to so many people? But Jesus says, bring them here to me. And so he orders the crowds to sit down on the grass, and he takes the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looks up to heaven and says a blessing. He breaks the loaves, gives them to the disciples. The disciples start distributing, right? They give them to the crowds. Now, if you think about this, the 5 loaves they're talking about, we're not talking about like big, like what we think of as a loaf of bread these days. These would be just enough for one guy to have a modestly sustaining midday meal. So something probably about yay big, right? And 5 of them for 5,000 men, not counting women and children. There are some estimates it could have been double, could have been 10,000 people there. And yet, they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. Now, how you end up with leftovers from what is not enough even for their inner circle should have given them reason to pause and think. But we're not told that they even respond at all. The people aren't said to, be grateful for this or thankful. There's a silence about a reaction. You're left to wonder. And it says immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. That by itself should also make you think, because they had one boat. And when it leaves, he's not in it. He dismisses the crowds and finally has some time alone on the mountain to pray, which is probably his original intention. And we have this sort of a picture drawn where he's up on the slopes. He's alone, he's praying. And the backdrop would be, of course, the sea. And possibly, if the sun had been up, it's evening, so it isn't, but you might have seen the boat out there on the water. and it was a long way from the land. And it's being beaten by waves, for the wind was against them. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, that's what it means when it says in the fourth watch of the night. So between 3 and 6 in the morning. So just before sunrise. It says, he came to them walking on the sea. It's this matter-of-fact statement. He caught up with them. Well, you could tell how badly the wind was against them if a man walking could catch up to them and overtake them. Because, I mean, in one of the other Gospels, it actually says he meant to pass them by. I can't help wondering if he was just checking to see if they were paying attention, if they would notice him out there. And boy, do they. They don't recognize him at first, right? They see him walking on the sea and immediately freak out, assuming that they're seeing a ghost. You know that people who live on the sea tend to be a little bit superstitious. Large bodies of water seem to do that to people. But they cry out in fear. It's a ghost. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, take heart, it is I. Don't be afraid. Which is a hard thing to ask when they're still trying to wrap their head around the fact that you're standing on water. But Peter, spokesman Peter, pipes up, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Jesus just says, come. It's like, hey, come on, join me. Jesus commands. Peter obeys to an extent. He gets out of the boat. He starts walking on his way to Jesus. But he gets distracted. It says, when he saw the wind. Now, we're talking about not quite a full-on storm, but it would have been very rough out there on the water. And here's a man who, he's probably been through a few storms in his time, but always from the safety, comparatively speaking, of the boat. Now, he's doing something that is technically impossible. He is standing on water and not sinking. And quite naturally, his nerve fails him. He gets distracted by his surroundings, he grows afraid, and he starts to sink. The one sensible thing he does is cry out, Lord, save me. And Jesus takes hold of him. And he says, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Which is kind of, I mean, you think about that. He started well, and it was working. As long as he was focused on going toward Jesus, he kept his footing. The moment he looked away and started thinking about how impossible everything was and how scary it was, he goes down until Jesus lifts him back up again and says, snap out of it, basically. And they both climb into the boat. The wind ceases. In other gospel accounts, it also says that they were immediately at the shore where they had been aiming. But Matthew's primary concern here in telling this story is this last part. That those who had seen all of this, who had experienced it, they fall down in worship. And these are good Jewish men who know, you will worship the Lord your God and no one else. But what they've seen is something only God could do. And that when you're talking discipleship, you have to understand who it is you're learning from. And you have to regard them with that proper light of respect. And when it comes to learning from the Son of God, worship is entirely appropriate as a response. And they land at Gennesaret. It's not where they were actually trying to get to, but when the wind is like that, you just kind of go with whatever you can get. They end up at Gennesaret. The only other place in the Gospels where this place is mentioned is Luke 5. This was the place where Jesus had been preaching by the shore and had gotten into Peter's boat and had him put out so that he could speak without being pressed in on by the people. There's no mention that he had ever done any further ministry than preaching there, but when he gets there, everybody knows him. His reputation has spread. They recognize him and they send all around and say, hey, bring out your sick. Jesus is here. And they beg, even if they could only touch the fringe of his garment, they would be made well. And that was how it happened. Which makes it, think about it, practicality wise, is much more efficient if he could just walk among the sick and they just reach out and touch the fringe of his garment as he passes by. It saves a lot of time, but that's not the point. The point was that they knew his power and believed so implicitly that they were convinced that even if they just brushed his clothes, he would heal. This kind of attention is not likely to go unnoticed. So the Pharisees and the scribes come down from Jerusalem. These aren't the local guys, these are the head guys. And they have a demand of him. All these people have been demanding healing of him, but they come with a demand for an explanation. Why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? Previously, you remember, they wanted to know why they were violating the Sabbath. Jesus went to some pains to prove that they weren't. Now they want to know why they are ignoring the oral traditions that had sprung up around the law. And Jesus, he answers their question with a question. And why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? They had come to place human interpretation of the law on a par, if not a higher plane, than the law itself. And he points out an example. God commanded, honor your father and mother. Whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, kind of echo back, right, to the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said, but I say. And so here's the reverse of that. God said this, but here's what you say. If anyone tells his father or his mother, what you would have gained from me, I give to God, he need not honor his father. Somehow, their oral tradition had gotten so convoluted that in its many loopings around, it ended up contradicting the law of God. And he says, for the sake of your tradition, you have made void the word of God, you hypocrites. Well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Now, this would have been more than enough to garner him some hostility, further hostility, I should say. They were already pretty hostile. Further hostility from the leadership. If this had happened in private. It didn't. There was a crowd. He called the people around him and he said, "Hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person." You have to understand how much of the tradition of the Pharisees was about avoiding defilement. The whole thing about the washing of the hands before they eat, that was to avoid defilement. You may have been out and about and touched something unclean. If you were then to serve food with those hands, you would not only defile the food, but everyone who ate it. And Jesus is saying, you know what? The kind of defilement you're talking about doesn't come from what you put into your mouth. It comes from what comes out of your mouth. I always like this disciples question. Did you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this say? Yeah, I'm pretty sure it wasn't subtle. And of course, that word offended in the Greek is where we get our word scandalized from. But Jesus says, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone. They are blind guides, and if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. But Peter said to him, well, explain the parable to us. It's like, I didn't think it was that complicated that it needed explanation, but okay. You could read that under, are you also still without understanding? Logically speaking, when you think about it, he says, do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth, your words, proceeds from the heart. And this is where the defilement is. Out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. Not eating with unwashed hands. He is far more concerned with the spiritual defilement that comes from our own lack of righteousness than from any ceremonial defilement that might come from our surroundings, from our externals. The whole point is, what is righteousness? And righteousness, it has to come from the inside out. It cannot be applied externally. And knowing what we know, in hindsight, we know that he came to provide the righteousness that we just don't have. We can never generate it ourselves. He has to give it to us. And so he goes away from there, and he withdraws to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Now, we've talked about that. That was part of that woes on Bethsaida, Chorazin, Capernaum. Tyre and Sidon was a Gentile area. So no wonder a Gentile woman, is referred to a Canaanite woman from that region, who comes and cries out to him. And you have to think about this. We kind of skim over this sometimes, but a Canaanite, a Gentile woman, cries out, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. Now, what would a Gentile woman know about the Son of David? She had obviously been paying attention to the news that was surrounding Jesus. And she knew certain things about him. In fact, she seems to understand his identity better than most Jews. He is the son of David, the promised Messiah. He is able to free her daughter from spiritual oppression. That's what she's asking. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. She also knows that he's ministering to the Jews, but the Gentiles will not be left out. How do I know this? Because he tests her faith. First, he doesn't say anything. And a lot of people find this really troubling, this incident, because it seems like Jesus is just perpetuating these stereotypes, the prejudices of Jews against Gentiles. Because when he doesn't say anything to her, she keeps crying out. She will not be left behind. To the point where the disciples are begging him, say, just send her away. Say something to send her away. She's making this racket. She's crying out after us. And Jesus says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He said this in her hearing. And she comes and she kneels before him. Lord, help me. Now he speaks directly to her. And even this is not encouraging. It's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But her response says, yes, Lord. She acknowledges, no, he is the Messiah of Israel. But even the little dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. And at this point, he praises her. O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire. And her daughter was healed instantly. Like earlier, the centurion who had said, I'm not worthy to have you in my house, just say the word. Here too, we have a non-Jew who seems to understand Jesus better than the Jews do, who shows the persistence of faith, knowing who he is and what he can do, and that he is compassionate. Why do you suppose she kept following him, even without any encouragement? She knew what he was like. And follow and respond in faith and humility. She was not demanding of him anything. She was throwing herself upon him in faith, just saying, you're the only one who can help me. I know you can. And I know that that's your nature. And her reward is praise from Jesus and a positive response to her request. And more than this, he continues on from there. And it just says he's walking beside the Sea of Galilee. But if you cross-reference the Gospels, you'll know he's somewhere in the region of the Decapolis, primarily Gentile area also. And this is where we find he went up on the mountain, sat down, and great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, placed them at his feet, and he healed them. And the thing that persuades many that these crowds were largely made of Gentiles is that their response is they wonder when they see the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. The phrasing seems peculiar if they are Israelites. But if it's a mixed crowd, it makes perfect sense. That these people who have lived in polytheism, maybe even pantheism, they now see the true power of the one God of Israel. And 3 days this goes on. We find this out because Jesus calls his disciples to him and says, I had compassion on the crowd. They've been with me 3 days and have had nothing to eat. Now that's persistence. And of course, his disciples ask the logical question, where are we going to get bread enough in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd? And not quite possibly as big as the previous crowd. There's 4,000 men, besides women and children. So if you double that, maybe 8,000, something like that. And he's like, well, how much do we have on hand? You'd think they'd be thinking back to the previous incident, saying, wait a second, this seems familiar. But there's no sign of that. They just say, well, we've got 7 loaves of bread and a few small fish. They're actually even in a better position this time than they were last time. And the same thing happens. Jesus directs the crowd to sit down. He takes the loaves and the fish. He gives thanks. He breaks them. He gives them to the disciples. The disciples give them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And again, no account here of reaction. Not from the disciples, not from the crowd. But what he does get is another visitation from the Pharisees, this time accompanied with the Sadducees. Though these 2 groups hated each other with a passion, they are certainly unified on this front. They come to test him. They ask for a sign from heaven. Sign from heaven. Have they not seen any of the signs? Oh, they've seen them, but they think they can demand one to test him. And he says, well, when it's evening, you say, it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, ooh, it'll be stormy today. The sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. This too has happened before. They have demanded a sign from him, and he tells them this time the same thing he told them last time, only in abbreviated form. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah. And he left them. And I want to end on this last little vignette, chapter 16, verses 5 through 12. Because this is one of those moments in discipleship. They've left, they've got to the other side, and wouldn't you know it, they forgot to pack any bread. And Jesus, he starts teaching them. Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And as they discuss it among themselves, this must be because we forgot to bring bread. And Jesus, aware of this, he says, oh, you of little faith, why are you talking about bread? Why do you discuss among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember? 5 loaves for the 5,000, and how many baskets leftovers you gathered? The 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Here's the thing, and this is the principle I'd like to leave you with. Too many times we take the Son of God and apply his words to our preoccupations, our preconceived ideas. That's how we get such heretical statements as God helps those who help themselves. And, the popular 18th and 19th century idea that the Bible supported the enslavement of Black people. People come to the Word of God and they bend it around what they're already thinking about. And this is what the disciples are doing. They're preoccupied with the fact that they forgot to bring lunch. And Jesus is saying, oh, I want you to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They hear leaven and they're thinking bread, and they're like, oh, he's scolding us for not bringing bread. And Jesus' exasperation is kind of like, bread is not an issue. It is a non-issue. You've seen what happened. Little becomes much when I bless it. Quit thinking about bread. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And in another place, he also says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. That is the teaching of these people. So, discipleship wise, here's a very valuable lesson to keep in mind. When you approach the Word of God, try to be aware of your own preoccupations at the same time. That's why we study together, because we don't all have the same preoccupations, generally speaking, and we can catch each other in this. Because the Word speaks to us. The Word of God is living, active. But we can't make it say what we want, what we're I'm trying to think. We can't approach it in a way such as to support what we're already thinking. We have to learn from the Word how to change what we're thinking, if that makes any sense. So we'll take that as the ending of this week's study. Next week, if you could carry on reading through Matthew 16 through 17, and yeah, chapter 18 is another of the discourses, so we'll try to get through that. See how we do.